Children have been playing with toys for millennia. It's part of the way kids understand the world around them through games, puzzles, and action based games and activity games. Play has always been part of kids' lives. And as we start to get to the modern era, a lot of play based companies, toy companies, whatnot, really started looking at the way children play and assigning what are called play patterns, meaning definitive ways that children interact with toys and with, call it their peers, other classmates, in very, not as much structured ways, but patterned ways. And it became clear as modern times started encroaching on when the world was only in black and white and all of our memories were, that modern toys were going to create new play patterns that hadn't existed before. And it really was the emergence of plastic in the 1950s and 60s that truly brought in things like, collecting and doinky doink play of small little characters, call them dolls, call them action figures. That play pattern, while you could find ancient versions of these in, Egyptian tomes and Mesopotamian archaeological sites, modern action figure and doll play really came into its own with the advent of plastic. And that was what allowed children to engage in what the industry calls doinky doink play, meaning they're smashing two characters into each other. And it's very similar to the way ancient kids played. They just had, better constructed toys. Same exact concept, same play pattern, but now thanks to the modern fun of plastic, you could essentially have the same type of play, but it was more disposable and it was more easily available. So, plastic, action figures, everything's going great, right? And we've got decades and decades of fun in front of us. Well, a lot of things changed around 1999, 2000, and part of that was what came out theatrically and what spilled over into the toy aisle. So I want to look at two examples. One being Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the first new Star Wars movie we had since we were kids. Obviously now we're on a path of unlimited Star Wars movies, but when this came out, for those of us who grew up playing with Star Wars toys, whoa, there were going to be new Star Wars toys. And a lot of us were kind of in college, grad school at this time. We didn't really have kids of our own. And this is what gave birth to a brand new play pattern that had never really been around before. And the toy industry called this souveniring. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, the idea of collecting action figures and collecting Star Wars action figures is nothing new under the sun. People have been doing that since they came out. And while kids were the main audience in the 70s and 80s, and they actually engaged in traditional action figure play, having the characters battle, go into spaceships, go on adventures in their mind and become avatars of the imagination, we had something that was different when Phantom Menace came out around it came out in 1999, but there was a lot going on, which I'm going to get into during this kind of time period. So a lot of people who were adults and excited about the film looked back at their Star Wars figures and realized there was a lot of value in them. There were certain figures that were worth thousands of dollars. And kind of like the speculation market that happened in comic books, all of these new images and new characters and situations, and I'm talking like pre-movie coming out, right? When we were all just excited about the trailer and, Duel of the Fates. The figures started rolling out, and while there was play value, they were structured and aimed very much also at the nostalgic collector who remembered having them as a kid and now wanted to be the first on their block, no pun intended, to race out and buy the new figures. And yes, that's me doing that at Midnight Madness in Ventura, California, where I drove an hour and a half from my college in order to buy Phantom Menace toys at midnight. Obviously, I was not the only one who did this, but hey, see, I am a toy collector too, not just a professional. And while people ran out at midnight to fill up their hands and carts with Phantom Menace action figures and product, a lot of the scramble was because we thought, there's only going to be 3 more Star Wars movies, and this is going to be it, and they'll be just as valuable as the figures we grew up with. Kind of not taking into account the huge production numbers that were behind even the Power of the Force 2 figures just a few years earlier, which you can still find for SRP in comic book and used bookstores. Now, while there were new characters to buy, The speculation, again, much like the 1990s comic books where people were buying, Superman 75, The Death of the Man of Steel, assuming that this was going to put their kids through college, there was a little about with Phantom Menace. But, when Hasbro made $1 million in one day, it was the fastest toy line to go to $1 million. Well, it just showed how much product was out there. And the more product that's out there, the less it's going to be worth money in the long run. And there was no limit to the number of items Hasbro put out, as well as the other toy partners. A lot of it heavily featuring Jar Jar, who was supposed to be the breakout character, and that didn't quite happen, but hey, if you wanted that Jar Jar candy dispenser with a real opening mouth tongue action, hey, you were set up with the slew of product that was coming out and hitting toy shelves. All right, so while the product was aimed at kids and call them adult collectors who, were now in college, starting to maybe have families, there was a very interesting thing that changed. And it wasn't just the fact that Star Wars toys were seen as something raising in value, it was that we were going to see Phantom Menace, and it was a communal experience. Everyone's like, hey, have you seen the new Star Wars movie? And it was like you weren't cool if you weren't going to see it. I mean, everyone had to see the Star Wars movie, even if you weren't a super hardcore Star Wars fan. It very much became a cultural moment to see if Star Wars still had the magic that it used to. And that's where souveniring comes from. So this was a term that's used in the toy industry a lot, and it essentially means that you're buying a toy product just to remember something. Souvenir, after all, is just French for memory. That's what the word souvenir means. It's the verb in French for, to remember. So while traditional souvenirs, we think of them as something maybe commemorating a trip or an event, action figure souvenirs now became a visual reminder both of the way we loved a property growing up, but more so for the community aspect of participating in an event, and in this case, going to see Episode 1. Some of us slept out on the street for 3 days on an inflatable Millennium Falcon. And going to see this, whether it was with our own children or our friends, our colleagues, our adult friends who acted like children, whatever the situation was, it was a communal experience. So buying a Phantom Menace figure wound up being part of the memory. And very much true also for Lord of the Rings. And it actually has some great examples because this movie also became a cultural experience where we all sort of wanted to be on that journey together. And if you look at the first wave of Fellowship of the Ring figures that Toy Biz put out, one important aspect is that they all had action features. Kind of like the old Superpowers figures, if you will, from the 80s, where there were levers sticking out of their back and, magnets and all sorts of things that, would cause them to kick and punch and, swipe their swords and, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was absolutely the child of what was Superpowers, which really popularized action features. Although Masters of the Universe had that too. I don't want to discredit He-Man and Skeletor and all that for their twist-waist action. But Superpowers was kind of all about the punching and kicking with levers. In fact, some of the figures were so well designed that they actually had action features by pushing a lever that could pull back on a bow and arrow and shoot the arrow, which I thought was amazing. But often the sculpt was compromised in order to accommodate this action feature. This Aragon figure is a perfect example because when he's not posed in the shooting arrow moment, he definitely looks like he's, not really exactly ready for battle. Another perfect example is, do you remember the cave troll figure packed out in this open tray with the action feature being the smashing arm lever moment, even with a try me on box? Obviously aimed at kids, action features, and because he had a real rubber skin and it was an open tray packaging, you could just pick the skin off of his face in the store, and this happened to thousands and tens of thousands of units that were left unsold. Now, what happened with Lord of the Rings, much like Phantom Menace, is the toy manufacturer realized that while they were aiming the product line at kids, it was adults, and more so casual adults, not necessarily the hardcore collectors like you and me, that were buying them and putting them on shelves and just looking at them, hence souveniring. They were buying the figures to commemorate going to see this film. Same thing with Phantom Menace. So As Two Towers starts to come out, you'll notice one of the most dramatic things is that the action features started going away very quickly. A line that was originally intended for kids to have try me's in the package and, kicking and punching, by the time they got to the tail end of the line, the emphasis was completely on sculpts, and in fact updating figures that had previously been released in the beginning of the line, but just with an improved sculpt that wasn't hindered by an action feature. Yeah, there were some, like the light-up sword Frodo had, but for the most part, by the time they went to these coffin blister packages, you were just getting new versions of popular characters in different outfits, but without the hindrance of a lever and a mechanism, you could focus on the sculpt and the articulation, which is what collectors and even casual toy buyers wanted. You could even buy the entire team in one set with these huge box sets they put out, with multiple versions of the lead characters over and over again, now focusing on sculpt over action features. Heck, even the Cave Troll got a more collector-friendly re-release with a window box, preventing casual toy buyers from now picking his otherwise ugly face off and making him look that much uglier. I guess, can you make a Cave Troll look uglier than he is? I guess that's proof that you can. So this time period, this sort of 1999 through 2005, was a very interesting golden age when both kids and adult collectors and casual collectors were all buying figures. And if this trend had continued, much like Disco Stew says, hey, it was the perfect marriage of wanting to experience a toy and a consumer product. Souveniring was looked at as like, wow, so what happened?
What's that? War were declared.
Yep. Well, when we went to war in Iraq and suddenly oil fields became an issue and getting access to oil became an issue, well, petroleum, oil, is the foundation not just of large amounts of the economy, but plastic is a derivative of petroleum. It's made, most fun things, most toys are made from oil. So now that oil was skyrocketing in price, you could no longer afford to put out figures that were priced to a more casual fan. Sure, the adult collectors would always buy, but when things like Marvel Legends, as an example, went from $7.99 with a giant Build-A-Figure piece to fast forward to today, and they're pretty much $22 with a much smaller Build-A-Figure piece. So you're paying more and getting less. So this difference, when you used to be able to get a figure for under $10, that was that magic price point where a casual fan would souvenir. And as prices went up, when oil went up, the casual collector who was just buying it to remember a movie he or she saw was like, not interested. Combine that with the fact that then screens started coming out, pulling children farther and farther away from action figures, and that magical time, that sort of, 1998 through 2006, see how I added a year on either end from the previous slide? It dissolved, and what was going to be the future of toys, where casual fans were now souveniring action figures to remember a movie, well, with the prices going the way they were, this stopped just as fast as it happened. It's almost like it was over before it began. It was a great moment in time, and that's why we were getting so much cool stuff in that kind of 5-10 year gap, around the change between the 90s and 2000s. Souveniring, it was an awesome thing, but it was quickly over. I hope this video was insightful, and let me know your thoughts in comments below. I always comment back. Share, ring the bell, subscribe to this channel. It all helps support it and tell YouTube to share with more people. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.